insights, analytics, and overview. And we're happy and honored to welcome our guest speaker today, Mr. Venkatachalam Ramakrishnan, Head of Solutions and Pre-Sales, Europe Persistent Systems, London. And his 15 plus years of experience across banking, financial services, insurance sector, and various roles played in data science, engineering, product delivery, service delivery, pre-sales and solution, sales management creates a passion for embracing newer technology landscapes. I hand over the session to you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me share my presentation. Right. I'm good to start. So I will start. I can see about 32 attendees. So I'll just start and people can come and ask and when they are joining. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm given to understand that I have come at the fag end of the Knowledge 4.0 technical webinar series. I had a chance to watch the previous sessions and listen to what was spoken before me. All the speakers were very deeply entrenched in their subject and the topic that was given to them. And the way they covered their topics was also really good. That really showed their passion. Most of it that they covered was new to me, and it was a good learning process for me. Kudos to all those speakers. So what I've done is I've kept my session very light. I thought it might make a bit more sense, given that some of the deeper subjects have been already covered, and I will try to give some practical insights on what I have witnessed in this data domain, having worked on both sides of the fence, both as a data and insights consumer, as well as being in the analytics team, churning out models and deploying models in the real world. So I have seen how the models that I have deployed has also been used on the business front. Hopefully, this will give you a more pragmatic view on what happens in various domains. And trust me, not everybody builds deep learning models every day. Most of the business problems that we tackle needs a lot more simpler, explainable solutions that is fit for purpose and is helpful in terms of making the business adopt newer means of working, right? Because every model that you deploy or every data platform that you put out there will also have a business process change that is accompanied, so that people start using that model or the data that comes out of the platform. So I have hence taken the liberty of tweaking the session a little bit, since the speakers have already covered a lot in terms of visualization, analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. I'm going to just piece all of this together and call it on all things data. Right. So a quick introduction about me. I have over 15 years of experience across functions such as sales, pre-sales, delivery, and that spans across industries like banking and financial services sector, working in a fintech startup, donning many hats, working for two of the largest betting and gaming providers here as a BA functional architect, evangelizing and developing cloud-based infrastructure data platforms for two large lotteries, and also playing the role of a chief data scientist for a travel conglomerate. So post my engineering from Jaya Engineering College, which is where I met Janardhanan sir, and my MBA from IIM Lucknow, I started my career in ICICI Prudential Life Insurance, selling insurance to retail and high net worth individual segments. That gave me a first-hand experience in on-field sales, like how to recruit insurance and investment advisors, and also how to pitch insurance products to client, which is not easy at all. Because you will end up giving a sales pitch saying that if somebody passes away, their family will get money. So it's not really a nice sales pitch to start off with, especially from a career point of view. I then moved to Citibank and worked for close to 4 years. I started off in the retail banking analytics division, and there were quite a few things that me and my colleagues did, including building a data-powered relationship manager sales pitch engine that gave a full view of customer footprints to the relationship manager that enabled them to have a meaningful conversation with the client. We had also built many upsell and cross-sell models, churn prediction models, as well as pricing models, and a lot of what-if analysis for portfolio management initiatives. My second stint in Citi was was that of a small and medium enterprises product specialist, advising companies on their trade and treasury products, bank guarantees, letter of credit, foreign currency loans, buyer credit, forward contracts, and so on and so forth. I then moved to a fintech startup company where I was involved in a more broad-based role, defining and building the functionalities of a pre-built BI platform targeted for banks. So I was doing some amount of solutioning, pre-sales, and delivery for banks and prospects across Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East, Europe markets. I then joined Harman Connected Services, where I was for close to 6+ years. That's where I got deeper and deeper into data. And as I said, the last role was that of a chief data scientist for a travel company. So that's my short intro. And this is the most verbose slide I have. Rest of the slides will be pretty light. Right. So the agenda for today is very simple. There are only two things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about something called as the data science mosaic, which tries to piece together all the components that goes into building a data analytics ML platform. And I will try to get into each of those styles, double click on it, get into a bit more detail, and explain what those styles mean in real world, and also share a couple of stories. Of course, I have anonymized the case studies on what I have seen from a real world perspective in terms of solving a business problem using data. Right. So the first style is what I call as the data source style. So this involves trying to figure out what the various data sources that are available in terms of source systems or otherwise. So any system that generates data of interest becomes a data source. Traditionally, data sources were called as OLTP systems, online transaction processing systems. But today, there are many more systems that collects and stores data, which is of interest, and that is of non-OLTP in nature. So one of the classic cases that of, say, Twitter feeds. If you have launched a new product and you want to know what is the emotion around the product, you're going to scrape Twitter feeds in order to understand what your customers or influencers are speaking about that product or that specific launch. So that is a non-OLTP data source, which is of interest to us. It might not be a everyday data source, but during certain events, it might become a data source for us. The second tile is what I call as the pipeline. So pipelines are like blood vessels. They carry data from a point A to point B for various reasons. So in our context, they take the data away from sources to a predefined area, which the analyst can use for any purpose. So it can be for building simple operational reports to building complex data science models. Then comes the infrastructure piece. So that is like the skeleton or the backbone on which large scale data platforms are built, or even small scale data platforms are built. So this can be as simple as buying a small server that runs simple models, right, on some CSV data that comes once a week, to building a full scale solution using some of the latest tech stack that is available, like cloud architectures that can scale seamlessly as the data scales. So infrastructure is also a very important tile in this ecosystem. Then comes warehouse. Sometimes it's also called as a data lake these days. So this is what we used to traditionally call as the OLAP system, the online analytical processing systems, that was purpose built to bring data from various sources into a central location and help business report from there. So this is where most companies do their daily reports, like what was my sale yesterday, etc., and also perform ad hoc data analysis and build models. The fourth tile is the reporting tile, and this is where you've already seen tools like Tableau. So one of the earlier sessions, I think the speaker was showing a demo on how reports and dashboards are built on Tableau. Every business will need certain matrices to be measured on a daily basis, like daily customer transactions, daily end-of-day balances, balance reports, and so on. So such well-defined reports and dashboards are churned out from what is called as a reporting stack or BI factory. Then comes the crux, which is the analytical tile itself. It's the all-encompassing box which you have already come across. So you have seen supervised learning algorithms, unsupervised learning algorithms, text analytics, text mining, sentiment analysis, etc. in the previous sessions. So typically, business will want to know more about their performance and areas of improvement than just looking at operational BI reports. And that is where this piece comes in. There will be certain internal or external events that can trigger this style, right? So suddenly, if the business head sees that his sales is dipping, he might want to dig a little bit more deeper into his portfolio to understand what is happening within his product segments or customer segments, right? So that is where these ad hoc analysis will start coming in, and that is where data analysts will start torturing data for certain amount of insights. And if they figure out that there is an opportunity, a hidden opportunity within the data, they will start building, say, cross-sell, upsell models or churn prediction models and so on and so forth. So this is the analytics style. Then comes the validate style. So once the model is built, the results need to be interpreted and validated. And there are a few ways in which you can do this on an ongoing basis. This is a very important step. So when I do the case studies, I will show how we used to do this, or in terms of both at the time of building the model as well as deploying the model and running the model for a period of time, just to know if the model is performant enough over time, because model also decays over time because consumer behavior changes, or business condition changes, seasonality changes, and so on. So the model will decay over a period of time. So there are ways in which you can figure out whether the model is performant or not over a period of time. So that is the validate type. I'll put one more tile called the solutioning tile. It's a key tenet here. Solutioning is not just architecting a platform or putting out the functional flow. There is a hidden element here called problem construction, which is more of an art. So in data science, problem construction and solutioning is one skill set I usually see missing in today's data scientists. Building a statistical model per se is not too difficult, because nowadays there are lots of libraries available on Python. There is, it's almost like no code systems that are coming out, right? So you just invoke a library and tune a few parameters and look at the results, and that's it, job done. But that alone is not a data science model. So how you construct a problem is a very, very important piece. And when I do the case study, hopefully you'll be able to appreciate why that becomes very critical before you start building a model, that entire solutioning piece. And the last piece, which is often underrated and also overlooked, is the selling skill. If you're building a data platform or building a model, you're actually bringing in a cultural change in the organization. So there is no point trying to build a deep learning model or some of the latest models that you can think of and use high sounding words like convolutional neural network or any of those jazz without the business understanding what it is. So the data scientist should have the ability to sell his solution in business understandable terms, so that the adoption of that platform or the model is there in the business, and he can see his model working in real life, and business can also realize the benefits. So selling is a very important piece of the entire data science mosaic, which again we will touch upon briefly towards the end of the presentation. Right. So let's go a little deeper into each one of this. Right. Coming to data sources are of different types, right? So there are structured data sources, semi-structured data sources, and unstructured data sources. So the traditional sources of data, such as the OLTP systems, are powered by a database engine, which is usually a RDBMS engine. And the newer non-traditional sources like web scraping, etc., are more API based, right? So data is typically divided into two major categories for most practical purposes. One is facts, and another is dimensions. So facts are anything that you record from a transaction perspective. So if you're a bank and there are some credit and debit transactions that are happening, those are called as factual records. These are transactions that can be summed up and reported, or there can be mathematical operations that you can typically do on fact-based records. Dimensions are your group by variables typically. So it's like, say, region, branch, product category, customer age band, and so on. So at a very high level, a data element can be classified as either a fact or a dimension. And the data sources can be considered as a traditional data source or a non-traditional data source. And the incoming data can be a structured, semi-structured, or unstructured data sources, data elements. So let's look at what these are. Structured data is what we call as well-defined entities. The incoming data structures change very slowly because there is a proper data dictionary that is around it. So take a core banking system, for example. When a retail customer walks into the branch or goes online to open an account, the front-end system captures the information about the customer. This is stored in core banking system database, and there will be something called as a customer entity, which will capture all the details, be it the name, address, phone number, KYC details, his marketing preferences, and so on. This is what we call as dimension data, and that will go and sit in something called as a customer entity. Now, as the customer starts transacting, the transactions are posted into customer's account, and the balances are constantly updated to reflect in real time. So this helps to process or deny a transaction. Now, these records are what I call as facts. The data from such facts can be used to do summary reports like day-end balances at customer level, or number of transactions that happened at a branch, at a product level, split by region, by day, by week, by quarter, and so on. So structured data is used for straightforward operational reporting. It is very easy to implement a data platform that runs off a structured source system. But that's not always the case. In my experience, I have seen many structured data sources going into out of life support. So there is in one particular instance, I was working with a client who had a source system which was more than 30 years old. It is outside the license, outside the support that the source system providers were providing, and there has been multiple custom changes that has happened in that source system. So, for example, there was a date column there, which looking at the column definition, you will think that will capture the date on which the transaction happens. But to our surprise, we also found that in certain instances, the same column was used to store the quantity of product that was sold. And that's because of historical legacy reasons. They didn't want to do any source system changes. They wanted to use an existing column as a placeholder and use it for both date as well as quantity in certain instances. So such things were not documented. It was not updated on the data dictionary, and it was all there in the person who was maintaining the source system in his head. So tomorrow, if that person leaves or retires, to reverse engineer that logic and bring all this data into the platform will be a nightmare, even though it's a structured data source. So there are challenges even with structured traditional data sources. Coming to semi-structured or non-traditional data sources. So these are typically tagged data, which means the data has the metadata element also within that. So standard examples are JSON and XML. The advantage of such format is newer metadata can be inserted on the source without any massive changes. So there is no need of a core banking system provider to come and update a definition of an entity. All we need to do is, if a system is capable of producing a JSON or an XML feed, we just need to tag a newer element, and that's it, job done. So from a source system perspective. However, to analyze or report on the newly created metadata will be a bit of a challenge. But the trade-off is the challenge of analyzing or reporting data from a semi-structured data far outweighs the flexibility it gives from a source system perspective. The most used example for semi-structured data processing that at least I have seen is the clickstream data. So there will be source systems like Telium or Google Tag Management or even Twitter API feeds, which will just keep giving you JSON feeds. And as and when an entity gets created, it will seamlessly insert that key value pair also into the feed automatically. So which means that if you have a data lake on the other side, which just keeps storing the incoming data, you don't have to really go and do a TML or a TDL change there. So it just keeps coming in, and it just keeps getting stored. However, as I said, to analyze, you will have to do a bit more parsing and bit more changes on your downstream system side. So that's on semi-structured. Unstructured there are no entities defined, like the text within documents, videos, images, voice, etc. So these are all the different types of data sources that we come across on a daily basis. So this is just a quick summary on what we have discussed so far. So there is structured data, there is semi-structured data like textual data, XML, JSON, and sensor data, and then there is metadata, which is data about data, the key the key entities, and then there is textual data, image, file, video, audio, which is the unstructured piece. I just put this graphics in here because it looked nice, and most of you would have already seen this, and plus I had an empty space. So this is the kind of data that gets generated in 60 seconds on internet by the minute. Right. So next we will move on to pipeline. Right. So to me, pipeline is like the lifeline when it comes to analytics. So pipeline is like the blood vessel. They help move data from one place to another place for the right reason. So pipelines take data from various source systems, it will try to bring all the data into a single place or into purpose-built data ponds or data lakes for different reasons. So if it is a finance team which is trying to look at a financial report, they might not be interested to bring, say, clickstream data into their warehouse, right? So they would only look at building pipelines, or they will ask the IT team to build pipelines which are more from the accounting systems and ledger systems. If it is the CRM or the marketing team which is building the data lake or models, they might not be interested too much in the financial reconciliation system feed, for example. So they would be more interested in clickstream data, social data, data feeds from some of the downstream systems like Salesforce or any other marketing tool and so on. So pipelines are the ones that keeps moving data from one point to other, and the reason it moves is it takes the load away from the source systems. So if imagine an analyst is going to go and query the source system directly, especially on a day when there is a massive sale happening, the database will go down and it will become unavailable to the website or to any of the transaction processing applications. So what pipelines do is it will try to take the data away from these source systems, dump it into an area which we call as a warehouse or a data lake or a sandbox, so that the analysts or the BA report engineers can work off the data. Now, little bit more in detail. Typically, in the industry, this is called as the ETL or ELT, which is extract the data from a source, load it into a place, and then transform it into usable entities, or the other way. So extract while it is in flight, transform it, and then load it into a in database. A lot of applications today, I mean, the way the design is being done is people are moving from ETL to ELT, especially after the advent of big data and transient layers that are present, which gives a lot more processing power to transform large quantities of data and taking the load away from a traditional ETL engine. So ELTs are becoming more and more performant and more prevalent. There are also various architectures or design patterns that you can use. One of them is push, which is the source system itself, as and when it generates, can push the data into a lake. So the most typical example I would say is how the clickstream data works. So as soon as a click happens, the data gets transported into a buffer queue, and as and when the buffer fills up, it then zips all the data that has been collected in that buffer into an S3 bucket. So this is how most of the tag management solution works today. So they will either give a queue size of or a buffer size of, say, 100 MB or 200 MB or 250 MB, and if the website is traffic heavy, this will get filled up within 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Or if the during night times when the transactions are lower, it might take about an hour or a couple of hours for the buffer to fill up, and then it will just package everything up and then push it into another area. So the ETL tool need not go to the source system to pull the data. Rather, the data gets pushed out of the source system itself. Pull is typically what used to happen earlier. So the OLTP systems, imagine there is a database which the core banking database system which records all the credit and debit transactions for the day. At the end of the day, or in near real-time basis, it will also mirror to a different DB from a failover perspective. Now, at the end of the day, since the mirror DB is not a transactional DB, the pipeline engineers will typically point their pipeline to the mirror DB, take a day and snapshot of it, and then tail the database to scrape away the data from a delta feed perspective. So if I've loaded data till yesterday night, when I hit it today night, I will just look at the date index and then say that get me all the transactions for the last 24 hours from this index record onwards. So that is a pull system. So even today, many ETL design architectures follow pull, but push is also becoming more and more prevalent now because the design pattern itself becomes more and more scalable. It's not constrained by the ETL per se, because all the data gets pushed into one area, and after that you can process it at your own leisure. You don't have to worry about sudden spikes in traffic and so on. Everything gets into one landing zone, and from there you can slowly start scraping away the data. Then there is asynchronous and synchronous design architecture. It again depends on the use case. So if there are real-time reporting requirements, or if there are real-time actions that are required, uh, use cases, a customer is on the site, he is looking at a particular product. You want to quickly look at the amount of time that he has spent, the areas that he has clicked in, the products that he has browsed, and then serve him a quick pop-up, which will say that buy this product instantly and you'll get a £5 off, right? So if you want to do such real-time recommendations or real-time offer processing or personalization, at that time synchronous feeds comes into picture. Usually you will not use synchronous feeds for reporting reasons. Most of the businesses that I have seen are happy to get a report which is a day late on very critical days, like if there is a big sale that is happening or a product launch that is happening. They might want to get reports which are refreshed by the hour, just to see if the campaigns is running properly, or if they have to do a quick course correction which cannot wait for a 24-hour time period. So that is where asynchronous data feeds comes in. Asynchronous is, it's not real time, it is near real time, or it is batch based. Another type of integration patterns that I see in pipeline is what we call as decoupled architectures. Decoupled architectures is, you try to have a handshake and have independently failable components, which will ensure that there is no domino effect. So what I mean by that is, if say for some reason your ETL servers go down, right, or your source system goes down, there is always some amount of data loss that might happen. So that is where people have come up with newer architectures, and I have also implemented it in one of the places that I've worked with, called as idempotent queues. So the source system will start pumping in data into a queue, which is like a neutral zone, and then there is a listener on the other side from a pipeline perspective, which will slowly start consuming the messages as and when it comes. So the advantage here is, even if the ETL servers go down, or your pipeline servers go down, the queue will expand seamlessly and it will keep getting the data, right? So you will never lose messages. Whenever your servers come up, you can take from the last read message. And same on this side also. So even if the OLTP systems are down and they are not processing data, there is nothing that will happen on the ETL side. It will simply keep listening to the queue. That's about it. So these are like decoupled architecture designs which are coming up nowadays, especially with the with cloud, and with with cloud, and with the fact that you want to change, say, certain licenses. If you want to move from one ETL tool to another ETL tool, you don't want to rip away all the system components and then rebuild it from scratch. You just want to plug and play only certain components. So it kind of gives that flexibility to customers when they get into decoupled architectures. So that's briefly on pipeline. This is a magic quadrant from Gartner, which just lists various tools that are available for the purposes of ETL. So I think uh, there might have been some sessions on Talend, if I'm not mistaken, but there are various tools that are there in the leader quadrant. I have seen Informatica, SAP, SAS, Oracle ODI, Talent. They are all well-versed tools. So if you want to pick up one ETL tool, you can pick any one of this. Talk to your university and see if you can get a license, student license, or a education license, and then train the students also on that. You don't have to learn more than one. I mean, the students don't have to learn more than one or two and one tool at max, because if 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 students understand, say, one tool very well, the learning curve for any other tool is not that steep. So I've seen my own team switching from SSIS, which is a SQL ETL tool, to நான் இப்ப yeah of course நான் எதுல விட்டேன் தெரியுமா?
I think you're talking about ஒரு pipeline pipeline அதுக்கப்புறம் அந்த third point
Yeah, I'm back.
Hello, sir. Sir?
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. So we're trying reaching you, sir. We couldn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had put my phone on silent. I'm so sorry. Where did I get dropped off? Any idea?
Sir, actually, pipeline slide, sir.
Pipeline.
Okay. Yes, sir. Very sorry, sir.
Oh, okay. No problem. Let me just check where it was. Okay. Was I on this slide or even prior to this?
Yes, this one, sir.
Oh, this one. Oh, okay, the magic quadrant. Okay. Right. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that I was out of network. Anyway. So hopefully I was able to complete the pipeline section and I was in magic quadrant. So what I was saying here is this is a Gartner magic quadrant which just categorizes various tool provider from an ETL perspective into various domains like niche players, visionaries, challengers, and leaders. From a learning perspective, any one tool in the leader quadrant would be good enough because I was sharing my experiences about working with my team where I've seen people being very strong on SSIS, which is a Microsoft ETL tool, going ahead and learning talent within a couple of weeks. So if students learn just one ETL tool, which can be even an open source tool, to the depth that they understand what are the various source systems, how you can transform data in flight, and how do you write logic in SQL as functions and so on, then learning any other tool will also be quite easy. So pick any one tool of choice which the university is giving, or any of these tool providers also will have university licenses at a discounted rate, and then accordingly students can learn this. Right. Okay. Moving to warehouse. Pipelines will bring in all the data that is available across various source systems into a central repository for various purposes. Because as I was mentioning, pipelines will take the load off the source systems so that people who want to query the data will not go to the source system directly and hog those resources. Because on a particular day, if there's a large query that an analyst wants to run, wherein he wants to summarize say last 1 year of data, if he goes and runs that query on the source system, what will happen is the source system will become unavailable for the front end for doing any transaction processing. So that is the reason why warehouses are built, and warehouses need not be one in number. It can be many in number, especially in large organizations. Why? Because not every team will be interested in looking at data that comes from various source systems. For example, the finance team will not want to look at how the CRM systems data looks like. So they don't want to see how many emails I sent yesterday. They would rather be looking at just the data feeds that come from the accounting and ledger system, right? So they might ask their IT engineers to build only the feeds that are coming out of the accounting and ledger system and not from CRM system. Similarly, the marketer might not be interested in knowing all that happens from a accounting transaction perspective. They would just want to know how my email campaigns are being performing month on month, year on year, how many clicks are happening, how many bounce rates are happening. And then he will want to do attribution analysis in terms of once I sent an email, how many people within 7 days are buying that particular product. So there will be purpose-built warehouses for different teams and different functions that you will often come across in large organizations. Over a period of time, these warehouses, which are also called as OLAP systems, like online analytical processing systems, have morphed themselves into what we today call as data lake. So data lake has become a slightly more generic term, which can handle not just structured data, but also act as a storage for unstructured data or fast streaming data that can be pushed into the data lake. And the engines that power that data lake again can be of various types. It can be row-based storage, column-based storage, etc. Most of the times, if it is a heavy analytical function that is going to use the warehouse, I have seen people going in for column-based storage because it is a lot more performant on select queries and on for writing ad hoc SQL queries and so on. There are also different types of data modeling techniques like star schema, snowflake schema, entity relationship, and all that, which I will not get into. And there are newer storage types like S3 and also transient layers that are coming in. Why I say transient layers is if you suddenly get a huge spike in data, and if your data warehouse is not able to handle processing and inserting and updating that data, what will happen is, especially on big data implementation framework, you can summon more nodes, more clusters, more processing power on an auto scaling basis just for that particular time period. Use that horsepower to transform the large amounts of data and then insert it into the database layer and kill those clusters. So it is more like a pay-as-you-go transient layer that some of the cloud providers are providing today, which is actually bringing down the cost from a capacity management perspective on the infrastructure side. Earlier, if there were big events that were happening, say suppose there was a Flipkart sale that happens on a particular day, or the Amazon Prime Day, right? If such transient layers were not available, the IT guys will have to provision the infrastructure up to 100% capacity, which will be lying unused for most of the year, and it's only on those 1 or 2 days that it will be used to the full capacity. So transient layers are helping warehouses becoming more and more performant. Right. I'll just quickly run through to the use cases shortly. I'll just go through this. Am I still audible?
Venkatachalam, you are audible.
Sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right. I will just check the chat window for any questions so that I can. Okay. Right. No questions so far. Reporting. Now, once the data from a pipeline perspective has been taken in, and then it has been somehow stored in various formats, whatever be the format in from a warehouse perspective. Next comes what typically people say as hindsight, insight, foresight, and sometimes even oversight. So in business terminologies, people call it as descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and prescriptive analytics. So which is nothing but hindsight, insight, and foresight. Most of the hindsights are nothing but what we call as BI operational reporting. So these are typically reports that says what was your sale yesterday, cut by region, cut by branch, cut by product, and so on, or customer segment, right? This is what the C-level execs or any product manager would want to see. It is a fairly well-defined packaged report that will either be sent as an email to their inbox as an Excel attachment or as a PDF, or there will be a portal on which they can log in, refresh, and see what happened yesterday. So that is what we call as descriptive analysis or hindsight. Insight and foresight, we will come to it in a bit. But most of this you would have seen in the Tableau session. Earlier, the charting abilities were not much available in the BI tools, but today the BI tools are almost straddled between hindsight and insight. So they will do what we call as a report factory, right? You can do templates, you can define business rules, you can define matrices, and then make it run on a daily basis. Or you can also expose business entities to certain power users who can just simply drag and drop and do some basic analysis work. If they want to suddenly look at a new product in a slightly different way than what a pre-canned report gives, that is what tools like Power BI or Tableau gives in, and that is what you have seen in the previous session. So that's on the reporting side. Usually it starts with summary. And when I started off working with banks, most of this was done through Excel sheet. And even today, even though there are tons of BI tools available out there, many product managers and many people that I know on the business are very comfortable doing all of that in Excel, be it quick formulas, quick VLOOKUPs or pivots. That is like a lifesaver for them. So 90% of their work they do it in Excel. That is what I call as a summary or descriptive analysis. You can also do some amount of visualization, because not all data when put in a tabular format is easy to comprehend. So sometimes displaying it in a map or a squarified tree map or as sunburst charts might give certain patterns which wouldn't have been visible to a human eyes while just looking at tabular data. So that's where visualization also helps. Again, most of the BA tools have very similar widgets available. Earlier there were differences, like at least 7-8 years back, MicroStrategy had brilliant visualization, especially from an iPad rendering perspective, etc. But now I think everybody has everything. And what is also happening from a market perspective is many tools are now moving up the value chain and bringing in the reporting capabilities within themselves. So the classic example is Google acquired a company called Looker. Looker was a BI tool. Similarly, last year or I think earlier this year, I'm not very sure, Tableau was bought over by Salesforce, because Salesforce wanted to uplift the kind of customer 360 reporting that it was doing, and Tableau was a market leader. So Tableau was taken over by Salesforce. So you can see a lot of forward integration also happening, and this happened even with databases. So earlier Oracle database was quite a powerful DB server, but what they did was they moved left as well as right. So on the left, from a ETL perspective, they created this product called ODI, which is the data integrator, and on the right they created the visual layer for reporting called the OBIE layer. So they became a one-stop solution. Similarly, for SQL Server also, you had something called as SSIS, which is the ETL tool. Then you have the SQL Server in the middle. Then you had SSAS, which is the analytical cubes, and then you had SSRS, which is the reporting stack. So it became an integrated solution. So many standalone ETL tools which were there in the market got acquired by bigger players, and that is what I'm seeing in standalone BA reporting tool market also slowly happening. Right. So BI tools not just gives a hindsight, but also gives the ability for a power user to drive some amount of insight. So what happens is that Tableau is not just a reporting or a dashboarding tool, but to a power user, it will expose certain amount of business entities, dimensions, and facts, which he can drag and drop and do his own set of analysis. So when I say his own set of analysis, if there is a new product that was launched, instead of just looking at the pre-canned dashboard or a pre-canned report, he can build his own report or start asking some what if questions himself by dragging and dropping various dimensions that has been exposed to him. So most of the BA tools also gives that power of insight, right? So that's on the reporting tile from a data mosaic perspective. This is again a magic quadrant which puts various BI tool providers in various places. So you have Power BI, Tableau, Qlik, ThoughtSpot at the top. Again, from a reporting perspective, one tool is good enough to learn, and from a learning curve perspective, going from one tool to another, most of the, amongst the tools, it's always a gentle curve. I've never seen a steep curve happening when people have moved from one technology to another technology. So pick whichever tool is available in the leader quadrant from a university licensing perspective in an inexpensive fashion, and get the students to learn that. Right. Let me just quickly check if I'm still on. Yeah. Okay. Right. Analytics. Again, insight, foresight, and sometimes oversight. Many a times people say analytics, data science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence interchangeably. It is true to a lot of, the boundaries are not very, very clear. I have, depending on the person whom you speak to, you will start getting different definitions. But I'm going to just, package all of them into one. It is just the way you build model, the way you, make the machine learn from the data and use it for all good reasons, right? So what will insight, foresight do? Why something happened? So hindsight will say what happened. Insight and foresight will say why did it happen, and what will happen in the future, and what can we do about it if it happens. So a lot of what if scenarios, etc., that you can do. So typical normal use cases that you will see on a daily basis, even without deploying a machine learning tool, is what we call as forecasting. So I'm sure many of you who are there in the finance function within the college would be doing some forecasting on revenues or cost, etc. Right. Then comes if I have to look at, say, a problem like student pass ratio in a particular subject, right? So can I learn from the past data in terms of what type of if I model student personas, and if I also model teacher personas, and then I look at the way the classes are being taught for a particular subject, and then experiment between two sets of people to see how people are having different pass ratios, etc. So that is where data science and A/B testing and modeling, etc., comes into picture. I'm not going to get into that because there were a few sessions that happened before mine, which actually went into the code level. So there is no point, talking about it here. And then you have supervised, unsupervised, reinforcement learning, etc. But the most important piece here is the art of problem construction, and that is what I will take everybody through in the case studies that will come now. Right. This is again taken from the net, just to say that there are tons of algorithm available, and sometimes it's overwhelming to just say that where do I start. But in my opinion, if I go back, pick I mean, especially from a student perspective, if you pick one supervised and one unsupervised learning algorithm, it can be a simple linear regression and a k-means, for example, right, or a decision tree or a random forest, and then get to the depths and understand what is lift, what is confidence, what is antecedent, everything that comes from a mathematical perspective on how the models were built and the theory behind it. That is good enough, because once a person understands one model really well, understanding the output from similar models or variants of those models is not too difficult. And there's a lot of resources available these days on the net to learn other models also quickly. So pick one or two models and then learn them very well. And the other models can be just implemented using libraries and then interpreted. You need not get into the depths of all the models, right? Now, after you build a model, then comes the interpretation, validation, and verification. So this is where most of the techniques that we talk about, right, from a cross-validation data set or a test data set comes into picture. So typically when you build a model, you split the data into 60-20-20 or 80-20 and so on. Again, these are all splits that we will have to go through iterations to understand, which split works better. Similarly, there are cases where, we try to build a model without proper exploratory data analysis or a univariate analysis, or if you have not done proper feature engineering, the models are very dumb. For example, I can build a model for insurance sale prediction and have a feature called the starting alphabet of the person's name, right? The model is dumb enough to take it as a feature and also train on it. So feature engineering is a must. Exploratory data analysis is a must, and talking to business and having a proper domain knowledge before you start building a model is a definite must. So that is where even the art of problem solving or solutioning will come into picture. Then there is the problem of underfitting, overfitting, and not fitting, and then from a ongoing basis. So once you have built a model and you have tested it on the test data set, normally there are two types of testing that you do. One is called as in-time validation and another is called as out-of-time validation. So if you have a data set from, say, 2010 to 2020, 10 years of data, one type of modeling technique is you will cut the data randomly at 80-20. So which means that the 80% of the data on which you're training will have representation from each of the year, and the 20% test data set which you have not shown to the model will also have representation from each of the year, provided it's a true random sampling that you have done. Now, this is called in-time validation because the model was trained on the entire 10 years and it was tested on the entire 10 years, but on a data that it has not seen. So that is called in-time. Out-of-time is I take the data set of 2010 to 2019, cut it into 80-20, and then on 2020, I directly predict. So my trained model has not seen 2020 data at all. So it is out of time validation. I have used both, and I felt that especially in marketing scenarios, doing an out of time validation also, just to ensure that your model has not overlearned, and hence the probability of it decaying quicker is not present. It's always a good practice to do out of time. So what I mean is, in cross-sell cases, what I do is I keep away the last 3 months data. I learn off the previous data, and then I will assume that my model has gone into production 3 months earlier itself, and then make it predicted, and then see whether my model is still able to predict the ones properly, right? Using the reality data, just to see if my model is at least able to hold up for 3 months, right? So that otherwise, what will happen is there might be scenarios where if you don't do a proper out of time validation check, and you deploy the model in production, within 1 month you will see that your control group will start outperforming your model itself if you have overtrained it, right? So that is where this in time and out of time validation, etc., comes into picture. Right, and then control group and fallow group, these are again CRM terminologies. It again depends on the business use case, on how you want to benchmark your model. Control group is when you are implementing the model. I'm sure everybody will know, but control group is when you implement the model, you will not take all the recommendations from the model as is and do a CRM activity or an email campaign. You will only take 80% of the result. 20% you will randomly seed in and put a or you will hide it from a CRM activity perspective, just to see how your normal portfolio behavior is. So on your normal portfolio behavior, if you find that, so on a normal portfolio behavior, if you find that your cross-sell percentage is much higher than what your model is recommending, and especially after doing a CRM campaign, you know that your model has decayed quite quickly, or something wrong is happening there. So that is where you benchmark and you keep the model running and analyze the decay rate of your model, so that you know when is the right time to go ahead and retrain the model or revisit the entire model building process itself. So that is on the validation piece. Quick time check. It's 10:30. Just give me a second. Yeah, I'm still online. Should the test set? Okay, I'll just quickly take a couple of questions. Can we say cross-validation is the best choice among other validation techniques? Again, it depends. It's always good to do cross-validation to prevent overfitting on the data. I have not used cross-validation a lot of times other than for k-fold cart techniques. But most of my use cases has been on marketing side. So for me, an overfitting problem is not a great problem to worry about on day one, because there is no financial there is no realized financial implication by putting an overfitted model into production, because anyway I have my decay curves to capture quite rapidly if I'm doing a mistake. Should the test set have the same features as training set? Absolutely yes, because if your training data set has say 20 features on which it has learned, right, and it has created an equation, right, y is equal to mx plus c in simplified terms, your test data set should also have that. Now, it might so happen that in real world you might not have all of the 20 features available or populated. In those cases, right, you should do something called as missing value treatment or interpolation. So normally you take the mode of that particular column and you interpolate, right, or you pass in null values, or you default the missing values to a particular number so that your model can still work. So so my first level answer is yes, the test set should also have the same features as the training data set, right. I will quickly go to the infrastructure piece. I have 30 more minutes, so let me see if I can rush through this. Couple of quick points on the infra side. So even though people think that infra is not my area as a data scientist, no, in having a basic understanding of infrastructure is a must. Otherwise, what will happen is most of the deployments or the infra that you're being given today is pay as you go model. And I know one of my colleagues used BigQuery in GCP, and he wrote a bad query, and because of which we ended up I mean the cost was coming to some in thousands of pounds. So if you do not understand how pricing works or how the underlying infra works, sometimes the code that you write will not be right. Okay, so I will give a simple way in which writing good codes will become a practice, and this is something that I've personally also followed. I use a website called projectoiler.net. If you go to projectoiler.net, the first or the first question would be something like, list all the natural numbers below 10 that are multiples of 3 or 5. Okay, and find all the sum of all the multiples of 3 or 5 below 1000. Now, this question can be solved by a simple Python program or Excel program, and you can brute force it, right? You can simply write a loop of 1000, use a modulus operandi, and then write an if-else statement, etc., etc., and that's it, right? It will hardly take a nanosecond to run, right? Even on a 4 gig machine. But as you progress on projectoiler.net, look at the 600 sum. Now, there is 1 million prime factors, etc. So there are complications that will start happening. If somebody tries to solve the problems using brute force, they will keep running the code forever. It will not stop. So that is where smarter ways of coding, like using functions, and instead of just doing loops, can you use some kind of tail recursive with a seal of value? Take this prime factor, for example. A prime, you need not go from 2. So if I want to find if say 70 is a prime number or not, I'm just making it up. You don't have to go and divide it from 2 to 69 to understand whether this is a prime or not. You can just stop that loop at square root of 70, right? So that massively reduces the number of loops that you're doing, and hence the machine time. So ask the students to use projectoiler.net extensively, because that will discipline them to write good codes, which will make them aware of machine time, because machine time is money from a cloud perspective. So that's just one simple takeaway. I'm going to skip through this. These are just few architectures which I have anonymized and changed, which we have used. So I think it's not relevant from a data science perspective right now. I will get into solutioning. All right. So typically, companies use something called CRISP DM, Cross Industry Standard Process for Data Mining, when they start looking at a business problem and use data to solve it, right? And I will get into what the steps of CRISP DM are. It's almost very similar to data sources, pipeline, exploratory data analysis, etc., etc. This is what any good analyst will do without even knowing that he is doing CRISP DM, because that is just a general practice. That's all. So this is an open industry standard. SAS also has a standard called Sample, Explore, Modify, Model, Assess, SEMA. IBM also has a framework called Analytics Solutions Unified Method. Just for the sake of this presentation, I googled up and I put all these three. Frankly, I have used only CRISP DM. SEMA I was aware of, but I have never used. I mean, as a structure, but you would end up using it through practice. I have never heard about ASUM before, but in an agile working methodology, that is what you will again do, unconsciously. So that will come through practice again. Right. So just a quick look at what these are. So CRISP is that top one, business understanding. So you start with domain understanding, then data understanding, data preparation, feature engineering, then model building, certain amount of iterations, then evaluate, deploy. So that is the CRISP DM. SEMA is you sample just a small one, then you look at exploration, which is the EDAs, then etc. I mean, I don't want to get into this, but it will be good if people are taught CRISP DM in college, or any of this. That should be fine. Right. So let me go to some real life case studies. Quick check on the webinar. Yeah, projectoiler.net is for self-practicing various problems. Yes, it is free. You can register on that for free. If you remember, in early 2000s or late 1990s, Infosys, for preparing for Infosys interviews, people used to go through Shakuntala Devi puzzle book. To me, projectoiler is today's Shakuntala Devi. Questions don't come from here from an interview perspective, but it gives you a very good view on. It forces you to become a good coder over a period of time. So you will start understanding proper algorithms, and even some of the theoretical things that we learn from a complexity perspective, like the big O notation that we keep talking about, right? How to determine the complexity of a code or the machine runtime, etc. That will become a practice once people start solving projectoiler. Also, I'm not trying to sell projectoiler; it's anyway free. Projectoiler is good to learn a new language. So every time I wanted to upskill myself and learn a new language, right? I will just get into project rather than going to theoretical frameworks in a coding language. I'll just quickly take up a problem and then search. Okay, I would require a for loop and a if loop. So what is the syntax in that particular language that I'm learning? So that's how I self-taught Python using projectolder.net. I also self-taught Node.js, and then I've forgotten the languages also. So Project Learner is very good. Please use that extensively. Okay, no more questions. Right. So first case study is again a fictitious anonymized case study. So the client X was a flight booking company. Customers book flights and have the option to add a add-on product or an ancillary product. So it can be a travel insurance along with a flight ticket, or an airport launch facility, meals, in-flight movie credits, airport transfers, in-flight Wi-Fi, etc. Right. So these are all add-on services that a passenger can buy. And this is where the company, the client X, was also making money. And more than money, it was a hook to get the customer more involved with a brand, rather than just using it as a very transaction oriented brand where, I just book a ticket and I go from point A to point B. Why can't I give a slightly more better service to him by being the one-stop solution for everything around travel, right? So the problem was, customers did not buy the add-on products, and it was a high margin product for the brand, and and to give them a holistic and okay. So the problem statement was, how do we get the customers to traverse the path of the add-on sale through recommendation rather than an explicit bundling of products? Because the brand wanted to do it in a very subtle way, saying that, hey, you have bought a ticket, why don't you buy this also? So they want to buy some kind of a recommendation engine to just motivate the customer and guide the customer towards the add-on sale. Challenges: we didn't have a single view of customer. Historical customer purchases on previous trip was very difficult to stitch. Product master was weak. I mean, these are all things that you will keep hearing in every data science project that I have seen, or my colleagues have seen, or anybody in the industry will talk about. Other than a greenfield project or a new brand that is coming up, most of the existing clients with more than 10 years plus source systems will have all these problems, right? So again, we got some interesting patterns looking at the data. So we saw that only one or two add-ons were very strongly preferred, like travel insurance and meals. Other products had a long tail, which means the uptake percentages or the penetration of the portfolio was very, very weak. And the customers also tend to buy add-ons in the last minute at the time of check-in at the counter and so on. So that is how EDA is typically done. You try to get some patterns or insights from the data. Feature selection: we did 3 types of feature selection. So this is again going back to the equation y is equal to mx plus c. So we need to determine all the x factors here. So we built certain fact-based features like what was the ticket booking amount, travel date, time to travel, etc., etc. We built product dimension-based features. What is the destination type, what is the duration of the flight capacity, and then customer dimension. So all the features we did. Then there are a few models that you can build here, but we took an approach of clustering plus a priori plus business rule. Now, typically when you say recommendation, people will say collaborative filtering or cosine similarity. So why we didn't do collaborative filtering was because it requires the standardization of product tables and features of products, like reviews, popularity, pricing. So any online learning portal you go, a collaborative filtering standard example is Netflix movie recommendation. That is not applicable here for us because we don't have a feedback on add-on products. Nobody is going to go and say the flight was bad, but the meal was excellent. That was not going to happen, or that was not happening. Then cosine similarity again will tend towards a very specific lookalike of ticket booking with historical ticket booking, and it will always try to recommend the same product that similar ticket has bought to this customer also. So we are not really influencing a behavior. We are rather predicting a behavior that would have anyway naturally happened. So we felt that these two will not work here. So what we did was we started building customer personas, and that is through clustering. And then we built an a priori association rule on top of that. And then we overlaid some business rules on top of it again, just to build a recommendation that is customized to the persona. And it results in specific product recommendation driven by the seed product, the first product that he buys. So let me just quickly go through that. So what we did was we used all the variables at the time of flight booking. Historically, we took all the flight booking. At the time of flight booking, what are the known factors that we know that we have? So that will be the fact-based thing, like, when did he book the ticket, what was the time to travel, destination type, etc., etc. So all that we used, and then we built a unsupervised learning algorithm. We tried out many, like K-modes, hierarchical clustering, ROC, DB-scan, K-means, etc. Finally, we went with K-mode. That is because there were variables which were categorical in nature. Now, to run k-means, that would mean that we need to do one-hot encoding, and the data was becoming too sparse, etc. So we went with k-mode, and it kind of worked. And it was also, when we looked at the centroids, that centroids are what is the average feature within that persona. We saw that there was a persona 1 which had all the ticket bookers who were last minute bookers and would also like a discounted fare. So it was gelling well. It was the model explainability was also very nice. So we went with the K modes. And then what we did was, once we had the personas built, for those personas, we looked at various penetration of add-on products. So obviously insurance, travel insurance was number 1. For a few people, for a few personas, meals was number 2. For a few people, it was airport transfer. For a few personas, it was airport transfers, that was number 2, and so on. So every persona had a distinct popularity in terms of add-ons after the most popular product. So we were able to tease out the differences and pull apart the personas basis the add-ons that the clusters were buying using past data. So that was the clustering based popularity indexing that we did. So persona, and for that persona cluster, what was the popular product, and to what level was the popularity was. Then, so we kept this aside. Then we built a priori association rule with antecedent, consequent, lift, confidence, etc. So once the customer buys travel insurance, how many people who bought travel insurance then went ahead and bought meals as their second product? It would be, say, 30%. So that is how antecedent, consequent, lift, confidence, the entire rules came by. Then we also used, so this was point number 2. Point number 3 was, we took a few business rules as inputs from the customer itself. The customer said that, see, I'm launching a new service as an add-on, and I would like that to be bumped up. Now, if I don't overlay that as a seeded rule, my model will never tease out that as a recommendation ever, because historically that product was not sold at all, right? So I need to seed in that product forcefully through a business rule. So what we did was, we pieced all of this together. We took the existing bookers who are yet to travel, mapped them to the persona, okay, predicted them into which cluster they will belong to. In that cluster, we looked at historically what are all the add-ons that people have typically bought, and then we kept that aside. Then on the day of purchase of the ticket, these customers would have already bought 1 or 2 add-ons. Now, basis that, we ran the a priori rules to figure out, after this product, which are all the most popular products that people will typically buy, and took that recommendation and kept it aside. Then we also used the business rule. Then finally, what we did was, we took the a priori rule as the first priority, and whatever came out of a priori was the first recommendation I will give, followed by the rule based, because I wanted to bump up some of the newer products they launched, like the in-flight movie credits. And then we filled up the remaining 3 or 4 or whatever is remaining using the cluster popularity index. So that is how we built the entire recommendation of add-ons for customers who are yet to travel. And then email campaigns were sent, and we were seeing some good results also there. So the second thing also is, once the customer buys any of the recommended add-on, then again we will refresh this recommendation, because that needs to get knocked off the recommendation list and a new recommendation comes in. So if he has taken the a priori rule, so he might have taken the airport transfer. So in a priori rule, after airport transfer, what comes in? So we will push that in, and ensure that the 5 that we give is scrubbed against what he has already bought and is all distinct. There are no duplicates with it. So that's how we built this entire solution. A quick check if I'm still online. Yeah, I'm online, and no questions yet. Okay. Is it okay so far? Can I cover a couple of more case studies and then I will wrap it up? Jana sir or Dana?
Sir.
Jana,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh,
can you hear
cool.
me, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Right. Okay. Next, I will talk about a very interesting case study. This is again a rare event modeling. Not everything that we see in Edura or Coursera and the data set that they give, that 150 rows, etc. it all looks very simple when we do it along with the course, but in real life, it's very, very different, right? So this is one such case. Again, I was a part of the team that did it, but I didn't do it. It was a PhD data scientist who did it, and it was very interesting learning experience for me. I'm anonymizing the client. It was not a bank; it was something else. But let's just map it to a bank. So there was a bank that was experiencing fraudulent ATM transactions. The client was looking at some analytical solution to detect such transactions so that the customers could be reached proactively. So they're not going to stop the transaction, but if any of the transaction is flagged off as a fraud transaction, they would want to proactively reach to the customer and ask, did you do the transaction? Now, the problem is ATM frauds are a very, very rare event. In the sense, there are millions of transactions that gets posted, and hardly 1 or 2 transactions might be a fraudulent transaction. And until the customer realizes and reports it as a fraud transaction, he will not even know that it is a fraud transaction. So the labeled data set is also a little big, because sometimes if the amount is small, it might so happen that the customer might not have noticed also for a long period of time. Suddenly after 6 months, when he looks at the statement, he will see that, okay, I didn't do this transaction. So the labeled data set is also weak. So it's a classical needle in the haystack problem. So finding a fraudulent transaction in millions of transactions is very, very difficult. And this is where your classical trade-off between type 1 and type 2 error comes in. So type 1 error is flagging a genuine transaction as a fraud transaction. So if I call up the customer and say, hey, was this transaction fraud? He might become a little irate saying that, no, I did the transaction. What kind of systems do you have, right? So it might go that way. And type 2 error is flagging a fraudulent transaction as a good transaction. So in most of the movies, we hear the dialogue, right? What is that? Many criminals can go away, but not a single innocent should be punished. So that is exactly type 1 and type 2 error. So flagging a fraudulent transaction as a good transaction, thereby incurring losses. So that is false negative. So this false positive, false negative are tricky terms. It all comes in what we call as confusion matrix, which I will show in a minute. And if we understand confusion matrix very well, half the journey is done from a data science perspective. Data challenges, again, whatever I listed. So what is a model landscape that we can use? Well, we can use a logistic regression, but again, this is a rare event. Random forest, again, it's a rare event. So we use something called as undersampling technique plus SMOTE. SMOTE is synthetic minority oversampling technique. That was the first time I ever heard it. So it is like you artificially inject fraudulent transaction, which looks like fraudulent transaction, to just bump up the ratio. So instead of 0.00001% of fraudulent transaction in a million transaction, you would just double it by just creating records which looks very, very similar. So it's synthetically generated artificial records just to bubble it up. So and then we used a lot of feature engineering. Again, these are all there online as white papers by many industry veterans on the banking side, like what are the features that determines a fraudulent transaction on ATM, credit card, etc., etc. So I'll not get into this. Modeling technique, as I said, we took a total population, we undersampled it. So in the total population, if the occurrence was 0.3 zeros followed by 1%, in the undersampled one, it was 10 times more. So the occurrence was 0.001 instead of 0.0001. And then we did a SMOTE to bump that 0.001 to 0.003. So which means you're undersampling it first, and then you're also injecting more fraudulent, artificially generated fraudulent records there. And then we ran a few models. This is confusion matrix. Confusion matrix is again, this is something because of COVID, many people will understand this better. So today many test kits are still being tested on how the false positive is, etc. So false positive is, it is actually a non-fraudulent transaction, but my model is saying it's a fraud transaction. So that is type 1. False negative is, it is an actual fraud, but my model is passing it as a genuine transaction. So that is type 2 error, right? Now, if you understand this bots well, I wanted to spend like 10 minutes on this, but anyway, I'm running short of time. 2-3 things: specificity, sensitivity, recall, and overall accuracy. These are all key terms that we need to understand to interpret the model results quickly, right? Now, at the end of the day, what is the trade-off that we are looking at, right? When you looked at the recall is the model. So recall is like this: the student, a student appears for an exam. How much of what he studied is he able to recall and vomit in the exam, right? So same way, the model has seen the training data set. It has seen which are fraud because it is labeled. It has also seen which are non-fraud, which is non-labeled. Now, when I give a question paper to it, which is my test data set, how much of what it studied is it able to recall correctly, right? So how many true frauds does the model capture at various probability scores? So that is recall. Recall is very simple to understand. Then comes the cost of implementing the model. So when I say cost of implementing the model, false positive by true positive is one of the measures. What it means is, if I give a list of potential fraudulent transaction that my model has predicted to a relationship manager or a customer services agent, and say that you need to call these 20 transactions and check with the client if there's a fraudulent transaction or not. Now, every call he makes is a cost to the bank because he spends 3 or 4 minutes talking to the customer, right? And if the customer doesn't pick up the phone, there will be 3 or 4 attempts that he will make. So false positive by true positive is a measure that will say how many customers, good customers that he needs to contact, who will say that no, it is not a fraudulent transaction, it is a correct transaction, before coming to that call, which will accept that it is a fraudulent transaction and hence lock my account, right? So that is how many false positive calls I need to make before I get to the customer who might have experienced a fraudulent transaction. So that ratio is very, very critical, and that is the trade-off we wanted. We didn't want to capture maximum recall. We want to balance it out in such a way that we are okay for taking certain losses as long as we are keeping the cost low. It is if people end up working in bank, this is another trade-off. When loans go bad, how much is the money that you are willing to spend to recover the loan? If the money that you spend to recover that loan is more than the outstanding principal itself, you might as well write off, right? So same way, if the cost of going and figuring out that fraudulent transaction, which will in turn save you some losses, is more than the losses themselves, you stop there. So here, in very simple terms, if I take this 0.3 cutoff, you see a number 1.77. 1.77 is, I need to make 1.77 calls where the customer will say, I have made the transaction. Before the next call, in that 2.77th call, the customer will say, yes, I didn't make the transaction. It is a fraudulent transaction. Can you lock my account? So I need to spend that extra 1.77 to find a fraudulent transaction. So that is the cutoff we took. Because if I go to 0.2, that cutoff is 3.8, which means my direct agent will be making 5 calls, out of which only 1 call will be a fraudulent call, right? The remaining 4 are genuine transactions. So that is not making sense to me. So 1.77 seems okay. You might ask, why not 0.9, why not 0.49? That is where the trade-off of recall comes in, right? So the recall, which is the blue line here, 76 means my model, which is the random forest smart model recall, it was able to predict 76% of the transactions as fraud. Now, if I go from 0.3 to 0.2, the incremental benefit is only 2%, but at what cost? I will have to double my calling rate, right? So it is not making sense. So that is where we took a cutoff here. I hope it was okay. Okay, I mean, if you just see this a couple of times, the graphs, it's very easy to interpret. So confusion matrix and the cost trade-off on where you really Uh, am I audible?
So
Yeah,
you, yes, sir. Now you're audible.
I don't know what is happening today. Where did where did I drop off? Did I drop
Have you
off
been
in this
explaining?
slide?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes,
yes.
sir.
Okay. So, was I there till the trade-off that I was explaining, 1.77 and 0.76 by recall and this manual effort? Was I there till there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let me just quickly summarize, right? So in this case, what we were saying is 1.77 is the wrong call that the agent will make. So if he calls up 1.77 customers, okay, just for simplicity's sake, let's say 177 customers. So he calls 177 customers. All these customers will say, no, that is a genuine transaction. And then from 178 to 277, the customers will say, yes, you predicted it right. That is a fraudulent transaction. Please freeze my account or reissue my debit card. Right. So the cost that the bank will incur is that 1.77 wrong calls it makes. But in the process, it is able to capture 76% of the fraud. So 76 is the recall percentage. FP by TP is the manual effort required. Now, what I was mentioning is I can go down to the probability value of 0.2 and say that I can capture even more fraudulent transaction, but that even more fraudulent transaction is only 2%. And for that 2%, look at my cost escalating by more than 100%, right? So which means that my agent will have to do 5 calls before getting into one fraud call, right? So it doesn't make sense for the bank. So that is how we determine the cutoff. So here 0.3 cutoff worked well, so we cut it off there. Now, this is from a marketing perspective where there is a loss element is also there, right? When it comes to medicine, I was explaining COVID or cancer, I am okay to incur a higher cost as long as I capture more and more of recall. Because what is worse, if I tell a patient who has a cancer that he doesn't have cancer, or if I tell a patient who doesn't have COVID, who has COVID, that you don't have COVID, that trade-off cannot be quantified. So I will ensure that in those cases my cutoff is so low, I am fine to take a higher cost as long as my recall percentages go higher and higher and higher, right? So in certain cases, right, the trade-off is more what do you say? Ethical is the wrong term, but it's more towards saving lives. Whereas here it is just a financial loss. It's nobody is going to die because of this. Okay, that's a wrong statement, but you get the drift, right? So depending on the context, you will have to take a call between recall and manual effort, right? Can I go on for another 10 more minutes if that is fine? Or
Sure, sir.
okay, sorry about that. It's because of the network issues. I will skip through this addiction problem. Instead, I will skip through the rental property hunters also. I will go to this one. This is a very complicated DS model that we built. It is a custom built model, not a custom built model, but it's a combination of many models in one model to predict only one thing. So let me explain the context. This is again fictitious. I've taken it from a different industry and I've put it into this industry. The client is an international property developer, so he chooses exotic destinations to build holiday homes. And the high profile, high net worth clientele usually buys more than one holiday home over a long period of time. So somebody will have a holiday home in, say, South Africa. Somebody else, after 10 years, if I get some more money, I might buy a holiday home in, say, Spain. So that, after I retire, I can go between both the places and so on, right? So the problem is to find the best destination homes that will appeal to their existing customers. So it's a repeat customer problem. Unlike in a e-commerce industry where this is much more easier to solve because the transactions are high, people keep buying almost every month, every day these days, or even for mobile phone, every year people change mobile, so there is always a repeat customer element there. Here, people are not going to buy holiday home on a daily basis. They are going to buy, once in five years, once in 10 years, or maybe only once in their lifetime. because it's like a second home that they are investing in. So challenges, very small sporadic transactional data set. And since it's high profile client, the client demography will be withheld. The wealth details are unknown. And the distant past data is not clean, right? So how did we solve it? Okay. So I'll just spend 10 minutes on this use case. Maybe, if you see this a couple of times, it'll be easy. So what we did was, we looked at 10 years of data and we saw that only 5% of the customers had bought greater than or equal to 2 properties. So which means 95% of the customers in the last 10 years have bought only 1 property. And some of them within that 5% have greater than 2 properties, which means 3, 4, 5 properties, etc. in the 10 years period itself, which is like either they are super wealthy or they have got a lottery windfall, etc. So what we did was, first thing, we daisy chained the transaction. So assume that there is a customer 1. He buys a home in South Africa. After that, after maybe say 2 or 3 or 4 years, he goes and buys a home in Spain, holiday home in Spain. Then he goes and buys a home in Australia. There is a customer 2 who buys a house in Spain, a customer 3 who buys a house in India, right? Now, what we did was we flattened it out. So take customer 1. Customer 1, when he was in his first snapshot, maybe at the age of say 45, he bought a home in South Africa and then he went on to buy a home in Spain. At the time of buying the home in Spain, the same customer is in his persona 2. He might be say 50 years old now. He buys home Spain and after that he goes on to buy a house in Australia. Then the same customer now is in persona 3 at the time of buying the Australian home. He might be say 52 years. So this was 45 years, this was 50 years, this was 52 years. Same customer. But now we made it appear as 3 customers. So the persona 1 or the snapshot 1 of the customer was this, snapshot 2 was this, snapshot 3 was this, and against this snapshot of the customer is where I need to predict whether this guy, after buying the Australia home, will go and buy the next home. Then customer 2 had only 1 snapshot. He bought a house in Spain and after that he has not bought anything. Customer 3 has bought a house in India and after that he has not bought anything. So this is how we first daisy chained the entire data set. Then we did a first pass model. So in the end, we built 6 models and then we did a composite score. In the first model, we did what is called as a false positive model. So take all those customers that we have flattened out. Wherever they have bought a second house is my label 1. Rest all are label 0, which means these are my predictive variables, right? So there are features and then there are the variable that I need to predict. So 1 means he is a repeat customer, 0 means he is a non-repeat customer. Even though it's the same customer, customer 1 at snapshot 3 has still not purchased a home. So for me, he is not a repeat customer. This is how I cheat the data. After doing this, I do a 80-20 split. I blindly run any regression algorithm there, right? And then I predict the model that has come out on my training data set on all the zeros. Then what will happen is there will be some zeros that will be predicted as 1, which is nothing but false positive. What is a false positive? My model is saying he is a repeat customer, but in reality, he is not yet a repeat customer. So it is a it is a wrong recall that the model has done, or in other terms, the model has seen the 1s and 0s. It still thinks that this guy looks like a 1 and hence it predicted as a 1. So this is a very conservative false positive model that we first built. So from here, I have got one opportunity which says that this customer 1 will again buy a house, right? Now I keep this aside. Second thing we did is, the house that they were launching is called Home UK. Okay, it's a holiday home in UK. Now what we did was, we took that Home UK and compared it with all other homes across features, and then we figured out, does Home UK look similar to any other home? Does it resemble any other house very closely? Just one second, let me see if I'm still online. Yeah, I'm online. Right? So let's take one variable, say temperature. Okay, temperature in UK. So temperature in UK is maybe closer to Spain, but Spain is still in Mediterranean Sea, so it has glorious summers, whereas UK doesn't. So it is only 60% similar to UK. It is definitely not similar to South Africa, Australia, or India, right? So the home UK is very similar to the home in Spain. So what it means is, if a customer likes to buy in regions which are looking like Spain, then those are the customers who will also go for a UK home, something like that. That's the rough interpretation, right? Same way, when I look at a house in Spain, the Spain house is maybe closer to South Africa when compared to, say, India. If you take the house in India, maybe India is more closer to Australia. And I'm only talking about one variable here, which is the temperature. But of course, you have to look at all other product variables and build this, like square feet, price, amenities, location attributes, appeal, etc., etc. So this is the model 2 similarity, which is just basis the product attributes, right? So the first one was a false positive model. Second one was a similarity model. Now, this still doesn't give me the customer opportunity. So this is just an input to a model that is going to come down the line. So let's just keep this aside. Model 3 is a customer similarity model. So what I do is, for all the zeros, the daisy chained ones, right? I take all the zeros, then I go and see these zeros, the customers, do they look like anybody else apart from themselves in the entire data set? So for customer 1_3, who is a non-repeat customer, 2_1, 3_1, I take them aside, and then I see which is the nearest lookalike neighbor for him, right? So that is a similarity customer model. Here I see that customer 2_1 looks similar to customer 1_2, who was a repeat customer. So I immediately color him as green. Whereas customer 1_3 looks like 3_1, who is a non-repeat customer. That is why he is white. So all I am doing is I am taking my customers on whom I need to predict, the snapshot of customers on whom I need to predict, right? And I look at their nearest neighbor. If that nearest neighbor was a repeat customer, potentially this guy might also be a repeat customer. So that is the logic here. So I do the similarity customer model and I keep it aside. Then what I do, the same exercise as model 3, but instead of comparing the zeros against zeros and ones, what I do is I take for every non-repeat customer, find the nearest repeat customer. And the nearest repeat customer might be, 4 neighbors away. Doesn't matter. So I need to traverse 4 non-repeat neighbors to find the first repeat neighbor. Absolutely fine. But tell me who that customer is. So customer 1_3, who in my earlier nearest neighbor was nearer to a non-repeat customer. When I discard those non-repeat neighbors and go to the nearest repeat neighbor, I find that customer 1_3 is closer to customer 1_1, who is a repeat customer. So I forcefully find a repeat customer who is nearer to a non-repeat customer. Now, I keep this aside. Then what I do is, on that model 4, right, which is the closest repeat customer, I populate what was the second house he bought, right? So customer 1_1, that snapshot of the customer, the second house he bought was home Spain 2. 1_2, second house he bought was Australian home, right? So that is what I populate here and I keep it. Then I combine model 4 and model 2. So if you remember, we have built this similarity network. What I do is I simply go and say, what is the similarity of Spain_2 to home_UK, which is the home that I am currently building and I'm offering to customers. So if I find that it is 0.6, what it means is this customer 1_3 looks similar to a repeat customer who has bought a second house, which looks similar to home UK, and hence, so this is like a double hop. This customer, who is a non-repeat customer, looks similar to a repeat customer who bought a second house, which is 0.6 percentage, 60% similar to the current house in the market. So maybe this guy is a potential for me to go and sell home UK. Whereas this 2_1 is similar to 1_2, who bought an Australian house, which that second house is dissimilar to the UK house. And so hence maybe he will not buy the home UK this time. So roughly you're getting the functional flow, right? So similar repeat customer, what was the second buy? Is that similar to the current house that I'm offering? So that is the question that I'm answering, combining model 2 and 4. Once I get all this, what I do is I take my false positive score. I took my naturally nearest neighbor who might be a repeat customer, which is my model 3. And then I use the combination of model 2 and 5. And then I do a composite index. So if a customer is coming out very strongly in all the 3 models as somebody who will be a repeat customer, I will go and contact them. So this is broadly what we did, because it was such a tough problem to solve. We have to go all around to come up with such solutions. So I explained only 2. I had 2 more case studies, but we will keep it for another day. Why I picked these 2 case studies is, data science, the problem construction is an art. You need to understand the domain. You need to understand how to intelligently, come up with features, and then piece all of them together, and should be able to explain it in business-friendly terms to the business, so that tomorrow, if I go and give this list, immediately the direct agent will say, okay, this is the list that I need to go after from selling this house perspective, right? So that model explainability and selling skills will come only when we construct the problem right and do proper EDAs. So that is my last part of the presentation, where how you sell your model with good EDAs, backed by good feature selection, backed by good model selection, backed by annotation of the model or model explainability, and also projecting a business benefit which will excite the salesperson or the marketing person or whomever you're building the model to adopt that model, right? Last slide. Sorry for going over time. I'm given to understand that this is going to become a full-fledged engineering discipline. So these are some of the things which I think we should inculcate in students, because this is what I see in the various teams that I have worked. So that functional and domain understanding of a business problem is very critical. Before anybody jumps into a data set, they have to do some amount of research on what that industry is, what are the typical factors, read some white papers, understand the business dynamics very, very well before they go and construct any features. So that functional domain understanding is very, very important. Inner working of 2 or 3 algorithms to the nth level is very important, so that they can confidently defend whichever models they build. Presentation skills, which is both from a PPT perspective, and that anyway people will have, but even verbally being very confident, not using too many stop words. You don't have to be grammatically right, but presentation skills is a key aspect, especially in client-facing roles. Then problem-solving skills, which is what I just talked about, as well as writing good code, which is that project Euler example that I said. Some amount of data pipeline skills. Data scientists should not think that it is not my job. And also, pick up some niche areas like chatbots, unstructured data analysis, but that can come towards the later part of the courses. Understanding data management platform, Telium, or any tag management tools, CRM tools like Salesforce, Freshdesk, Selligent, etc. Pick any one tool so that people know how customer reach out programs and marketing initiatives happen. Because most of the models that we end up building for clients are marketing models, right? And then attention to detail. So these are all some of the key skills that we should focus apart from just pure play algorithms. That's pretty much about what I wanted to speak today. I skipped a couple of case studies, but we will do it sometime later. That's it from my side. Let's just quickly check the chat window.
Sure.
Yeah, model 1 to 6 have been done out of the single data set only. Yes, right. And how did we arrive at the composite score? That is where some amount of business knowledge also came into picture. And that was in discussion with business. So let me give a slightly more tangential example. I was speaking to someone in the e-commerce industry, and what he was saying is, even though we do a lot of good recommendations, like if somebody purchases a shirt, then the next logical recommendation is a pair of trousers. But on top of that, they will also overlay a couple of business exclusion tools. So if the shirt is from a particular brand, should I bump up the recommendations which of the trousers which is coming from the same brand, and also overlay color palette on it, because somebody who buys an orange shirt will not buy an orange pant, right? Or orange pair of trousers. So they will buy contrast colors and all that. So that is where business rules are key in determining composite scores. So it was done in discussion with the business. So what we thought was, since these were high-profile customers to whom we are selling homes, we should try to use the conservative model as the first pass model, because that will give us a list which is a lot more smaller, which is the false positive list. So we wanted to first test only with that, and when we found that that was working a little better, we gave a higher weightage in the composite score for that model. So there are various techniques for that. Domain knowledge is the key. In the last case study, which distance method is used to find similarity, cosine similarity indexing? That's what we used. How to differentiate impact of precision versus recall on a given case? Yeah, again, context. So here, since the cost of calling a customer was deterministic, so we knew that when a direct agent calls, typically it will be 2 trials before he reaches the customer. And these conversations on an average used to take, I think, 3 to 4 minutes, because there is a verification that happens saying that am I talking to the right customer? So last transaction is confirmed, etc., etc. So it is a 3-minute call to complete, 3 to 4 minute call. And we were able to say that for each call that the direct agent does, this is the X amount of cost. And then we also had the cost in terms of the losses that the bank had incurred, or whichever client that we did for incurred. So then we did the trade-off. So if you know the cost on both sides, then doing the trade-off is easy, and that's how you determine the cutoff between recall and precision. Okay, important methods to verify the developed model effectively. Again, in time, out of time, and there are many ways to figure out the, what do you call that, one tail, two tail test, etc. But I have always, because most of the models that I've built are classification models, for me, confusion matrix has been like a lifesaver, because once you explain confusion matrix well to a business user, then whatever model is behind it, be it a simple decision tree or a cart or a random forest or a neural net, whatever be it, right? The customer will blindly take it because he is able to interpret the results very well. So confusion matrix is what I have extensively used to verify the models that we develop. I think that's about it. I don't see any other questions. So I'm good to close if everything is fine with you, ma'am.
Yes, sir. So thank you, sir. And we have Janathan sir also. Can you join us, sir? Janathan sir.
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Yes,
So
madam.
on behalf of Chennai Institute of Technology, yes, sir. On behalf of Chennai Institute of Technology, we thank you, sir, for spending your valuable time for us. And your session today was very interesting and informative. And you clearly explained the field of data science and data analytics, and the process, methodology in extracting data, and how to warehouse it, how to analyze the data, knowledge, and insights, and finding solution along with real-time scenarios. Thank you very much, sir. Happy to connect with you in future too.
Sure,
Thank you, sir.
definitely. And thanks, ma'am, and Jana sir for the opportunity. Jana sir is smiling because I was a student 15 years back, and he has helped me a lot when I met with a major accident during the semester exam. So he helped me with a scribe, and he supported me a lot by literally changing the exam hall from second floor to ground floor and so on. So thanks, sir, for the opportunity, and thanks, ma'am. It was good talking to you, and very good questions also.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Yes, and now this is the last session of the day of the 5 days program. So good evening all. As all good things came to an end in life, so is this faculty development program. And it has been my pleasure to host all the participants and the speakers through these 5 days. And we have been fortunate to have some of the eminent persons from academia and industry as well. And we are sure that the participants must have been benefited by attending this faculty development program. And I request Dr. Janathanan, Sir Professor, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Chennai Institute of Technology, to deliver the vote of thanks and closing remarks. Sir, over to you, sir.
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Yes, madam. So it is a great opportunity for me to propose vote of thanks. Department of CSE, Chennai Institute of Technology, Chennai, we organized a 1-week faculty development program on emerging technology trends in fourth industrial evolution plan. On behalf of CAT, I thank all the keynote speakers. Mr. Venkatachalam from Persistent Systems, London, Mr. K. Silvakumar, Mr. Dr. Mohan, Dr. Sivasankaran from NIT Trichy, Dr. Sivaselvam from Triple IT DM Kanchipuram, Mr. Sandeep, Mr. K. Manish Kumar from IBM, Dr. Banerjee, Mr. Ramesh from GUI, and many, most of the academia and the industries, they are accepting our invitation and they spend their time with us, and they given very good lecture for this 1-week FTP. My sincere and special thanks to Mrs. Vaijayanti Srinivasa Raghavan, Program Lead Workforce Management, IBM Global Services, for supporting us for the successful conduct of this 1 week FDP. We are also thankful for our beloved chairman Sri P. Sriram for supporting us in the new initiative that we are planning in Knowledge 4.0 webinar series. We believe that this 1 week FDP program will certainly help all the participants to understand the concept of artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, cloud computing, data analysis, and data science, etc. And how to relate all these concepts with real-time applications and case studies for our future generation students about fourth industrial revolution back. We, being an educators, have to adapt to the emerging technology trends and the future technology of AI, ML, DL, data science, NLP concept, and this incorporating the technology effectively into the classroom and our research and our major projects. I am also thank our principal sir, dean, HOD, CSE, and other heads of departments of Chennai Institute of Technology, Mr. R. Ramesh from Associate Professor, CSE Department, and Administrative Officer, Mr. And Dr. B. Dhanalakshmi, Associate Professor, and all the faculty members of CSE Department to supporting us to organize this 1 week faculty development program in a very successful manner. Finally, without you, that is, I thank all the faculty members. They are going to participating from various parts of India, and some of the students, they are participating this event. And without you, it is not going to be success. So I thank all the participants and the faculty members, senior faculty members out there, they are participating this event. So we thank everyone, and students from various part of this India. We thank everyone, each and everyone. So once again, I'll be thank on behalf of that is our CAC department and CAT. We thank you all for this participating this 1 week FTP. So during this COVID-19, the pandemic situation, so during the lockdown, that is, you know well, we are organizing this kind of event is very difficult. So getting people and other issues are there, the technical issues. You also may be facing many issues last week and today also. So you know well that is, so we are conducting this program in a very successful manner. So I thank all the participants and other faculty members those who are supporting to organize this event, and many of the faculty members who are having that is many work maybe, and you are spending this your valuable time for listening this. So we thank you once again. We thank you all for this participating this 1 week FTP, and please be safe and stay in home, and you have to adapt to that is our government of India and the government of Tamil Nadu. So the rules and regulations you have to follow. Now that is in India, that is especially in Tamil Nadu, so it is going to be spreading like anything. So please be safe in the home and stay in the home very safely. So once again, I thank you all for this participating this event. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for addressing all the participants and the speaker. Yes, sorry, I didn't unmute them. So thank you for all the participants for cooperating with us throughout these 5 days program. And you'll be receiving the feedback form link where you have to give your details correctly, name details, which has to be printed in the certificate. And you'll be receiving the certificates within 30th of June. And please be in the WhatsApp group for further updates, and I will mail as well. So I will mail all the updates as well once the certificate is published from the team. Okay, so we'll be receiving the feedback form link, and those have not attended the quiz assessment, please do attend it. So, and based on the attendance report and the quiz assessment responses and the feedback response, we'll be issuing the e-certificate. So kindly cooperate. So within tomorrow, Saturday, so that is 27/6/20, 6 p.m. So tomorrow 6 p.m. So kindly fill your feedback form and the quiz assessment form. Okay, so after that we will start the certificate process, and it will be reaching you within 30th of June. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.